base rate is fast. And the idea is that in those problems, there are two possible responses. One response has to be decoupled from knowledge, and that's usually the normative response. And the other response is based in knowledge. And especially in the base rates task, it's not obvious which response is better to give. I mean, the idea of normative response is the one that takes into account the base rates, but perhaps the description is also useful in certain contexts. And so I'm wondering if these are things that you have thought about with these sort of problems, and thought about how in a real life everyday context, when is it useful for us to decouple a response from our knowledge, and when is it helpful for us to take that knowledge into account where responding to similar things in the world?
Well, I get your point. I mean, it's not always the case. Sometimes you also have to decouple, like within the intuitive system, because there's like different intuitions. I mean, Borges published a paper with his team where you give people a description, but there's a conflict within the description. So with the Democrats and the Republicans, for example, within the description, you would cue like Republican, but then you would also add like this person likes ballet or something that you would not associate with a Republican. And in that case, there's also conflict, but it's not between like a normative logical response and background knowledge. Within the background knowledge, within the stereotypes, and you get the same effects and even stronger of conflict. So in that sense, it doesn't necessarily have to be, yeah, most of the time we're applying it between like logic and stereotype conflict, but it's more general than that. It can go within the system one, within the heuristics, within the background knowledge, there might be conflicts too, and you see the exact same effects, and there should be, because it doesn't need to be about logical normative knowledge. It's just like different responses that are conflicting within each other, with each other. So as soon as you have that, you'll have all of this too.
I guess the stereotype does contain some useful information, doesn't it? So it's not as if you should just make a decision on the base rates alone. I think you can, you use the stereotypical information to some extent, but you really have to modulate, to reason normatively, you have to modulate your decision with base rate information. It is so important. I mean, especially in these extreme base rate problems where you've got, 955, Republicans versus, 5 Democrats. Although, there is base rate research that uses less extreme values than that, and that does reduce some of that conflict sensitivity. So I mean, some of the extreme versions really lead to conflict between the stereotypical and the base rate information. You can adjust the base rates to reduce the conflict. It's a good question though.
Could I just offer one observation on that, though, because I think it's a very profound question, and I actually don't think we have a good answer to when do we use our knowledge and when do we know not to use our knowledge? And again, if I go back to the suppression effect, where people, if you give them something that contradicts even the most basic simple inference, the modus ponens inference, they will refrain from making the inference. And yet they have that knowledge. So why do we ever make any inference? If we always activated our knowledge, we would always be able to come up with a counterexample or some other possibility, and we would just suppress every inference we make. So I think it's a really very profound question. How do we know when to switch that off and just deal with it? It really harkens back to the frame problem in artificial intelligence. What is relevant in any situation, and what do you decide isn't relevant? And I think we still don't really have a good answer to that, in my view.
Mark.
So start by saying I'm going to ask a question about cognitive science. We're in a cognitive science. In about 1990, I mean, I was trained completely as a psychologist, and then I learned sort of AI. I did have the view at that point that psychology was against random, and that within 10 years, undergraduates would have a firm basis in, not just computational modeling, but also logic and possibly even maths. That you would have a different type of cognitive psychologist. And one of the things that strikes me today is that it's like the different subparts almost, the perspectives of cognitive science. There hasn't been a rapprochement in one sense between them. I mean, we had, you know, Lyndon's talk was, I think, a brilliant exposition of, you know, a particular area of reasoning, you know, very much from an empirical perspective and talking about all these amazing findings built over thousands and thousands of studies. I think Lynn's account was one which was largely sort of an empirical one, but we started and talked a bit about mechanism and other aspects which I would call more computational. I think we did something similar to that. And I think David was like, to me, straight out of logic, you know, like I found it really hard, you know. And so we have, you know, roughly speaking, sort of three perspectives, if you like, historically, an empirical psychology one, a computational one, and a logic stroke mathematical one. And it just worries me that looking at the area of reasoning, decision making, it's like we're potentially still talking past each other with our own respective languages as though it's rather than having a single view. Is that unfair as a comment?
I think it's going to take time and more time. What I'm seeing, for example, you haven't seen any presentation where people use computational modeling, for example, but that is coming. There are like people.
You go asleep by that point. I talk for too long.
But really like a model where you would have like a drift diffusion, like specific, like then, but that is coming. Like if you look at the dual process framework, there are people trying to model what is the intuitive process doing, what is deliberation doing, when is one kicking in, based on, like, for example, drift diffusion models, where you can actually make more specific predictions. But I think that's going to be like the last step because it's like the most complicated step. All of this is just like mostly sticking to a verbal theory level, because like we started with the phenomena. The empirical phenomena, that research has been done over like the last 15 years. Yeah, there's more to do, but I think like the basic phenomena have been identified, and now, you know, coming to the stage where people will actually build models to account for that. So I don't think it's like something fundamental or this is like this big division. I just think it's going to take more time. I know there's like different groups working on it, and if you look at AI advances, that's exactly what they're doing. They're using these paradigms where you have like a fast and a slower process, and then looking at whenever there's uncertainty being created, you'll try to go switch to the more complex model. And so this basic architecture is being used. So I'm quite hopeful that that is coming. It's not simply like a promissory note that, you know, just give us like 10 more years, but at least I'm seeing some, yeah, things are changing at that level, I would say.
So you brought up AI and we talked about it briefly in the talk. And I was a little bit surprised by what she said, which was that people have a degree of doubt about the output of AI. Where in fact, what I'm reading here is that we're afraid that people are too easily confident in the output of AI and use AI as a way to offload their cognitions and are not very critical of, even though, you know, they all now come with this valuable learning that says sometimes make mistakes and check facts. You know, we never read out. And so the question is, what do you think about the possibility that people begin to lose the kinds of skills that we've all been talking about today because they no longer need to use them at all? Because the world is there at your fingertips.
Thanks. No, that's okay. But I'm not sure what way we're doing the questions. I thought we would each kind of respond. So let me respond first to Mark's question, because I think we didn't each get a chance to talk about that. I think that in terms of where the field has come from and where it's going. I think it is reasoning is a fundamentally interdisciplinary endeavor anyhow, because it has always had a close relationship between psychology, philosophy, particularly philosophical logic, and linguistics. Where it hasn't, and I'm disappointed too, that it hasn't had the same kind of computational development that other fields. So to my knowledge, the mental model theory is the only theory that has a computational model, a suite of models that simulate the theory in a computer program. No other theory of reasoning has done that except for Lance Ripps's old psychop one. And I do wonder why that has been the case. And it to some extent, I think it's partly related to the kind of fragmentary activity within reasoning compared to other fields, where other fields in experimental cognitive psychology have interacted with computer science far more. And the others might want to say something about that. But to get back to Valerie's question then, my take on that, Valerie, first of all, people show algorithmic aversion, I think, when an AI makes a decision about them. So when your bank manager says, well, our AI decision support system said you can't get your loan, that's what gets our backs up. You know, on your phone, you know, should I take this supplement now? Yeah, people will take all kinds of advice, partly because they may not even be fully cognizant that they are taking an AI's advice. So I think part of it is, if you like, that conflict detection of understanding that where you're getting your information from may not be as straightforward as you think. There is, I know from colleagues of mine who study attention, that there is definitely already signs of changes, neuropsychological studies and neuroscience studies, imaging studies showing that there are now brain changes as a result of certain kinds of attention changes that are occurring. So that's very worrying. And clearly, if there are working memory and attention impacts because of our use of phones, because of our constant kind of switching, then that may well affect our ability to reason, because we know it's so dependent on working memory resources a lot of the time. But you know, on a broader statement of, is it really impacting our skills? I'm not really sure that we have any evidence about that. I mean, I think it's too early to tell. There have been really rapid changes in the last even just 5 years with LLMs. So whether or not that's completely affecting, but how we reason rather than just how we attend and what resources cognitively we have available to us is another matter. So over to everybody else to answer all of the questions.
There are results now, of course, that AI commits these fallacies: base rate neglect, conjunction fallacy, and I've heard talks on how we can fix this, add something up above. Now, what's going on down below? I think looking back to the 70s, I remember so much discussion about what computers couldn't do, right? And the optimists were saying, we just really understand reasoning and how we do it, and we'll be able to program these machines. I don't recall anyone saying, I know there were such people, I do know that, but I don't, in the debates I was at, no one there, and only very few people on the periphery were saying, look, never mind all that. We just increase the training. We increase the database. We get all this power, and we just do that, and the thing will work. Now that has happened. The almost totally unpredicted thing has happened. And now we have it, and we don't understand why it works. Why does, when you put all this energy in and all this training, we get out these results that tell us so much, and which sometimes commit these fallacies. And that, to me, that is a huge challenge now, because it's doubly dangerous. We don't know how it works, right? We don't understand what it's doing to make it succeed in this way. And then we have this perhaps too great reliance or dependent on us. And after all, I've got to go on what you were saying. Our brains have been shrinking as a result of some kind of evolution. We don't know really the results of this, but they're getting smaller. Right? Now, maybe they'll get smaller still. We'll get less smart. We'll become more and more like dogs, vis-a-vis much less smart, because we're domesticated by the AI. Right?
And with computers.
You put the finger on some real worries, I think.
Wonder if I.
Okay, this back.
My question is quite broad, but maybe Barn might be the most advanced. In your conference, you talk with a very restrictive term when it comes to the concept of imagination. As the most popular, in the popular culture, imagination is exactly what may not be rational, or what might be causal. For example, a flying pig, for example, which is a very use of imagination, and it is one of the main components of human evolution. What made geniuses was that they constantly reinvented not only their own experience, but their own knowledge of what they had to pull out something that was new and that was completely unperceivable by most, whether it would be musical current, or what it would, for example, the invention of machines or materials that no one has ever used. And this is exactly the part of imagination that we cannot foresee, but it seems present. And when we go back through all the years, we cannot sustain about how these people couldn't think about what we have now, and yet it has always been. And this part of imagination cannot seem to be understood by the AI, because how can an AI that has to be fed with actual information can actually have this element of not only reinventing itself, but not only just choosing the system two, the type one, but reinventing them and try to get out and line which for goals that may not be perceived. That is the part of human that is actually the question: can or will AI be able to take this part of human that is what constitutes our human imagination?
It's a very interesting observation, and I think one of the breakthroughs, I think, in studying creativity in the last 100 years has been the development of the creative cognition viewpoint that people like Tom Ward and Fink and others advanced, that creativity might be a continuum. That these people who we think of as extraordinary geniuses may really be just at another end from the kind of everyday imagination that we all engage in, and that there isn't this big separation between one and the other. Because previously people were trying to study creativity from various different perspectives and not getting very far in understanding that. And others have talked about, Ronco and that have talked about big C and little c and mini c and all different kinds of creativity. And I think that idea that it's a continuum does help us to understand the basic cognitive architecture that's required even to explain something like extraordinary creativity. And if you have those basic building blocks, and if you understand what imagination is, and of course, people define imagination in various different ways, then it does raise that question that you raise of, can an AI produce something that we would view as creative, genuinely adding something that the rest of us wouldn't have? I think that takes us into those kinds of areas of consciousness and self-reflection that are really outside our purview in a way, in the sense that we don't have good evidence on it. So keeping it to be an empirically grounded conversation, I think we just don't know yet.
I think all the evidence suggests that AI can be extremely creative, just as we can be extremely creative. Usually the critics of AI in relation to creativity say, well, the AI isn't using kind of lived experience and hasn't got that emotional connection with the subject matter. But yet when you look at certainly the products, they seem to be as creative as what humans can produce, possibly through a different process,
Yeah.
But it's an interesting issue that will,
The free stuff isn't very good.
Yeah.
The free AI, but the more you pay, the more creative. Right?
question is about listening and imagination. So you mentioned that people build mental models to understand and reason. So I have two questions about this. First one is, do you think that because of different backgrounds or personal experience, do you think that can we make biased mental models because of previous experience? This is the first question. The second question that comes to my mind is in the case that additional information arrives, so could that affect the mental model that the human being built? That is important because once we understood that, we can build the experiment. Because that
Well, yeah, I think there's a few very important points there. One is certainly that our individual experience and our individual differences do affect the kinds of models that we construct. And in particular, that's through knowledge and how knowledge modulates the models. So me and Lyndon could each hear a particular sentence, a conditional sentence, and we could build very different models about it on the basis of different knowledge that we're bringing in that might inhibit a particular model or add a model to it. So we come to different interpretations of what you've said. So tracking the mechanism that underlies that modulation is crucial to understanding how people construct models, how they understand an assertion, what kind of beliefs they bring is central to the kinds of reasoning that they can end up with their models. The second question then brings to my mind anyhow the idea of defeasibility and whether or not if you get subsequent information in that say contradicts a conclusion that you've reached, that people are able to non-monotonically reason. They can revise conclusions that they have. They can revise beliefs that they have. And some of the interesting research has been about to what extent there are entrenched beliefs that we will not change and other beliefs that we will allow to change. And sometimes those beliefs turn out to be data beliefs, beliefs about evidence, rather than beliefs about, say, causal structures. So there is some progress in understanding defeasibility and what it is that we change when we attempt to incorporate new information into our models. Whether that gets us to any clear answer of how to address explainable AI, I think is really problematic. And Mark knows far more about this than me. But, you know, the issue these days now with LLMs in particular, and even with other kinds of machine learning models, is that even the people who created them don't know why they're giving the answers that they're giving. And so some of the approach in XAI has been to have a twin system, something that will provide you with an explanation. It may not actually be the reason for the decision in the first place, but it's an explanation that makes sense of that decision. So I think we're in a really very odd situation now with these models.
Sorry.
The question online. So Mohsen says, in one of the talks, it was mentioned that to prevent participants from engaging system 2 thinking, the researchers introduced time constraints. In your view, I think it's everybody, in your view, what other factors can prevent a person from switching into system 2 thinking during decision making? Could symptoms like anxiety impact the switching mechanism? And it's a analyst that talked about the dual process.
For sure. I mean, it's like typically what we're using is because we're defining system 2 as a slow system, the system that needs more cognitive resources. So time pressure, you're just not giving people the time that they would to engage in real system 2 thinking, or that cognitive load, because then the more you burden people's cognitive resources, the less they can use to engage in system 2 processing. But there might be others, like people have like played around with the idea that emotional processing, for example, is more system 1, although if you start really looking into the experiments, you see that some emotional processing for sure also requires cognitive resources. And if you put people under load, there's different effects, especially on reasoning. So a lot of for example, here in Canada, like it's Isabelle Blanchet, this is something that she's been looking at for a really long time, the impact of emotions on reasoning, and it's not all system-wide, it's not all intuitive. So anxiety, emotions, for sure, like there will be, I think, like situations in which it will trigger a more intuitive type of processing. Well, I wouldn't generalize it. Yeah.
Probably anything that can impact working memory capacity or both motivation, because I talked about both the motivational side, the disposition to want to engage in actively open-minded thinking, more reflective thinking, as well as the sort of capacity issue. So anything that can impact those could impact one's engagement in type 2 thinking. I'm thinking of things like fatigue would have a potential impact, distraction, task interruption. We all live in distractible, interruptible environments, which makes us susceptible to falling back on intuitive responding, whether it's kind of lots of emails coming in and we click on a phishing link in an email. These are all potentially things that could destabilize effective type 2 processing.
Some or maybe all of you were here 10 years ago, or just some? Yeah. And so maybe it's possible that you'll be here 10 years from now. So I'm going to ask an annoying question, particularly given, or maybe even cruel, given that this is the jet panel, or jet lag panel. Yeah. I want to know if you can make a prediction about the next 10 years, and as it pertains to the field. And you don't have to go. I mean, anyone who comes to that question, some sort of, and if you extra points if it's wild and crazy, but some sort of prediction about what you think is going to happen in the field. Please speculate.
We'll be having a next summer school on reasoning in 2036. I'm still there. I'm still there.
I'm the oldest, so I look back the farthest.
Oh, you'll be there.
You say 10 years.
10, whatever. Some amount of time in the future. What's going to happen in the field?
My father lived till he was 90, so perhaps I will make it. Perhaps. Oh, I'm touching wood. That's good. So what I see, looking at the profession, is an immense increase in basically, most simply, the quality of the young people who are coming on. Of course, there are many, many more women. I mentioned Dorothy Edgington, who was my PhD supervisor when she did 95. She supervised me in the 70s. I used to go to conferences where she was the only woman. Right? Now, of course, it's usually changed. And young people these days, I think they know more. They know more logic. They know more probability. They're better prepared across the board. And of course, by tests, they have higher IQs as well. So I think this trend will continue. We'll see more sophisticated applications of logic. Right? Now that we've all left the material conditional behind, finally, right? And we're not still. Now, one hope I have, when I came in to the field, I was shocked, frankly, that there were people still working on syllogisms. I could hardly believe it post-Frege. Now, I didn't know then that syllogisms have and are continuing to have more interesting results, especially on belief biases. But all this business, figuratives, moods, I think the early people who came in, they knew syllogisms and predicate logic and practically nothing else. Now we see many, many more quantifiers being studied, much greater variety of reasoning. So I hope now finally we'll leave syllogisms behind as well and move on from both the material conditional and Aristotelian logic. And I would expect that, given the sophistication of the young people who are coming into the field. There'll still be these specialist applications we've heard about with studying belief bias. I can't see like whole papers anymore being written on syllogisms. You have to be more general quantifiers. And as I say, it's much broader, sophisticated, uses of modal logic, possibility logic, and so on.
I suppose, I mean, I remain an optimist about interdisciplinarity, you know, and even though the last 10 years, I think we're still seeing experimental psychology being experimental psychology. I would hope that in the next 10 years, what we would see is a sophistication in methods. And the advice that I would give to any PhD student is to get a second method that, you know, for me, it was transformative when I was a PhD student, or it wasn't until I was a postdoc, actually. I learned experimental methods when I was a PhD student. When I was a postdoc, I learned to program, and that was transformative. Once you have two methods, then I think you really begin to look at your field differently. You begin to understand data differently. It's not just about correspondence to truth now, it's about coherence of a theory as well. And you begin to measure theories differently. And I think neuroscience is going to have that kind of impact as well on us. I think a lot of people are beginning to get more interested in thinking in neuroscience, and having that as an additional armament, I think would be really good. So that increase in methods, I would hope optimistically in the future that every student should have at least two methods that they're able to approach their field with and answer their research question, not just with experiments, but with something else, whether that's programming, whether that's imaging or something else. I would hope in 10 years' time we'd have a different flavour of talk based on that multiple converging methods.
And the other thing I think we'll see, Gord, I mean, I agree with both Ruth and David about the sophistication in the new generation of logicians and theorists interested in reasoning, and Ruth's points, you know, as well about around neuroscience, you know, experimental methodology, more convergent methods. The other thing is the pivot towards more applied research, which I think is important in its own right, but can inform theory, you know, the way in which real world reasoning is relevant to theoretical advancement and development. And I think in 10 years' time, we'd see more talks with a little bit more of applied, you know, flavor around them, around misinformation, disinformation, misdirection, all of these really important issues relating to, you know, how reasoning plays out in the real world, but how that can inform theory as well.
Well, I think like the obvious answer, of course, is 10 years from now, it's going to be a lot more about AI, and they'll need all of us. I think that's a good thing. If they want to figure out what these things are doing, they'll need specialists in reasoning, but that's obvious. I think more specifically for this field, like what is going to come back, like I see like a revival of the old like mental models, mental logic debate. Because a lot of the time, like when I'm doing research and presenting, people are like, okay, so but if we want to know what are these logical intuitions, like how is the intuitive system doing logic? I'm like, okay, like I don't know. But actually, if you turn things around and you ask them, how is system 2 doing logic? Define what is doing logic, what is doing logical, what are people doing when they're solving a syllogism? You've got the old debate between mental logic, mental models, and that has never been solved. Like, I mean, in the sense that Lance Rips would come in here and say, okay, yeah, I agree. This is how people do it. Like, so I think like, to me, the interesting question then becomes, so we're showing that system 1, intuitively people are doing certain things. Yeah, but then we still need to define how system 2, what deliberation is really about. What are people doing when they're solving syllogisms, when they're solving these, when they're doing conditional reasoning? So there too, I think like the good news for most of us here, that debate will come back. Like somebody will need to deal with it. Because it's too easy to say like, just show me how the intuitive system is doing it. If you're then not showing, well, show me like the mechanism, actually, the actual computations that are going on, but people are doing this deliberately. So at one point, I think like, you know, that will need to be addressed.
I do think this is a huge result, that people have logical intuitions, and we haven't come to terms with it yet. What is this logic? I mean, it's just astonishing when I think back, all that work on on biases back in the 70s when I first came into it. Nobody had predicted as well. As I mentioned the prediction about AI. Oh, really, underlying people have some logical intuition that's automatic. And it competes with the beliefs. And sometimes it does better than the beliefs at the automatic level. I think this is a really important result. And we really need to know what this logic is. What are people conforming to this logic? Sorry. We have a logician here.
Yeah, I have two agreements with you. The last thing you said, there is something like a competition in the human mind between the logical intuition and the beliefs and the biases. And I think that the understanding of the way these conflicts work is something that is very important. I think that your idea, Wim, about logical intuition is very important. It changes the game about the relationship between the S1 and S2 systems. And the other thing I agree with David is about the future. I would say that the future will be definitely in terms of sophistication of the explanations and of the models. And I would say it will probably come through interdisciplinarity. I mean, experimental psychology, reasoning, the field in which you're working, and the contribution of linguists about how language works.
Yeah.
The contribution of logicians, of course, and also I would say computer scientists who work on going further than the opposition between traditional explainable AI with if-then rules and the generative AI. And I would say to develop something like an AI that is at the same time generative and explanative. And I would say it will help cognitive scientists to understand better what machines can do and what human beings can do, and how there are similarities and differences.
Yes.
So I have 2 points. These 2 points. No, Danny.
I think we agree about that. Fully, that's the way things will probably go, and the way they could go.
To follow up on Elise question, one element that I think might have been in your question, correct me if I'm wrong, Elise, but I think one element that was interesting in your question is also what would be your views on decoupling versus rationalizing? So using knowledge to decouple versus rationalize once conflict has been detected. Maybe it's a question for Wim.
Well, I think like that's a good example of like, rationalization. We've been talking about it since the 60s, like the first dual process theory that Wazen and Jonathan Evans introduced was basically about rationalization, but still I think like it's a process that we do not understand really well. It's often like when we use it, okay, people are rationalizing, yes, they are engaging in some reflective thinking, but they're not coming up with the correct normative response. So there must be rationalizing, but actually what it is, rationalization, argumentation, like I don't think like we fully I don't understand it. Like I would love to know exactly what it is that people are doing when we're actually looking for explanations. And in that sense, and that's something that I do see to be happening, like, yeah, you'll need linguists for obviously, and I'm seeing more and more of that. Actually, I remember, Ruth, where we last met was at the workshop on the infant cognition workshop, and they're actually interested in negation. And so, but for me, yeah, rationalization, definitely, that's something that will need to be addressed. What is it? Like, it's engaging in reflection, and you're not using it to generate like a logical solution or a normative solution. So you're doing something else, but how does that work? I don't know at this point. I know. I've got like a functional idea of it, but exactly the mechanism behind it. And it's a really super important question for all of these different applications that we're looking at.
Yeah, it's a good, I mean, it's a good question because, you know, we really need to understand when it is that people engage in kind of confirmatory rationalization, really looking for justifications, confirmation versus, I mean, people can disconfirm. So, you know, what are the triggers that people take people down a more confirmatory route or a disconfirmatory route? I think, you know, we have some partial understanding of that, but it needs, you know, further investigation. It's you know, there's a metacognitive trigger that takes you down one route or the other. But it's, yeah, still a work in progress.
If I can, there's one. Sorry.
I'd like to come back to the relevance, the threat problem, the relevance. There are right now a reasoning model that is reasoning in LLMs, and the reasoning part is given in the post-training. In the pre-training, basically what you give the system is just the statistics of the people say generally. In post-training, that's where you give the system and they want the knowledge of the norms of what is permissible to say. So people like be racist and be and so on. And when they train nowadays LLMs to reasoning model, they do it in the post-training as well. And in the post-training, basically, if you can separate the training and the post-training. The first one gives, as I said, the statistics of the people say. And the other one basically is just how to shape what the system will output given number of norms, including logical norms. So the relevance, if you just look at the pre-training, it would be, it's relevant to say what people would say or have said recent before. But after that, you give it more and more norms to post-training with basically with reinforcement learning. And in some sense, I find it's pretty similar in the human case. That is, we start by grading the statistics of people say around us, and we learn our language that way and our knowledge. But then at some point, we get more and more reinforcement signals to we don't have to should say this in this situation, it's that, so on and so forth. So I don't really have a question. So I think that's one way AI when we use AI to try to understand how human thinks. That might be the way things are integrated. That is how we get how we get the knowledge, and then how we know what to say.
I mean, I suppose, initial thoughts would be that that it's not the way children learn, in the sense that you get those norms kind of interspersed as, it's not like you're trained up fully and then someone comes in and curtails all of those bad thoughts. It's that, yeah, it's so, and I do wonder whether, whether there is, if you like, a critical period for certain kinds of norms to become very embedded. So yeah, very much interleaved all the way through, and that might be important. Who knows?
We're having much fun. We were supposed to end at 4:30 and it's 4:35. So I would say, are you tired a little? Anyways, we have 800 days like this one, and the second one will be tomorrow, and Jenny will be chairing, and we'll still be with the psychologist. I'm sure we'll have as much fun as we had today. So see you tomorrow, and let's applause these people.
Thank you so much.